It's a great question, and I want to start in a roundabout way by asking all of you to think about what the world would be like if we hadn't had universities for the past 30 years, right? So pretty recent. We wouldn't have a COVID vaccine. We wouldn't have the mRNA technology. We wouldn't have Google, which was invented as a PhD thesis. We wouldn't have the World Wide Web, right? So it's I think the subtext of the panel here is that universities are thought of as sort of elephants that aren't adapting to the modern environment. But it's important to point out here, in a time when we're thinking how much universities has changed, that all of those were inventions and research which emerged in a university context, not because the universities were skill building, not because they were solving a problem, but they were addressing the problems of the future and creating enormous opportunities for growth and innovation. So I want to pick up on something here that Professor Rajkumar has said, which is, there is absolutely the important part of your question. Democratic resilience comes from speaking truth to power. And we often don't know what the truth is in a particular environment. If you again think about the COVID pandemic, we didn't actually know, were masks effective? We didn't know how to address many of the issues and we might know what kind of skills we think we need today, but we don't actually know what the key problems of tomorrow will be for many of the most important issues. So I think there are three things that universities do. I mean, there are two things, really, research and teaching, and I think they're going to change in three ways. So the first way in which I think they're really going to change is they're going to move away from knowledge. All of you have phones in your pockets, and you can pull up, as many of you probably have, right, the cutting edge research on almost any topic. If you want to know what the cutting edge research was on cancer 20, 30 years ago, you'd have to go to a university. Today, you can pull it up while sitting in this room. So they're going to move away from being places of knowledge hoarding and towards critical thinking skills. An example, you see this already in my university, we've totally done away with regular lecture styles. We teach only through case studies. It's a problem, what are you going to do to solve the problem? The second way in which it's changing in terms of teaching is related to the truth to power point. So how do we understand what the truth is? And that to understand that, you actually need to be speaking with people who have different opinions from you as sites of debate and discussion in environments that are increasingly polarized. And finally, and this is the point I've already made, is that they're huge centers of research and innovation. So let me just focus for a moment on the example of the COVID vaccine that emerged from Oxford. The research was well underway, which is why we got a vaccine in world record time. It wasn't there because it was solving a very discrete problem. It was experimenting. And it was that technology that got the world to a much better place 6 years ago, over the course of the couple years. Now, that wasn't just a question of technology in biology. It was virology. It was immunology. You needed people from behavioral science to think about how you brought that vaccine to the market when it had been developed in record time, and there were lots of skeptics about it. You needed people from business to understand how to get the supply chains in place. You needed public health experts and epidemiologists, right? So where are the places in society that we bring that kind of research together? It's universities.
All right, Professor Gomez, just building on, the sort of line of thought that I've been taking up with the other professors as well. I want to understand from you, you have a lot of experience in high-stakes multilateral diplomacy. What is the one truth about global progress that universities should really focus on telling their students, and something that they're probably failing to teach right now?
Well, I actually agree very much with what my colleagues have expressed so far. And I would like to build a contribution from the perspective of policy making and this interface between policy, the policy logic, which is most of the times responding to crises, problems, always against time, Time is always a constraint or a limit. And being in global policy making and in the midst of the discussion of global problem solving, one of the aspects that I think I was left with as a lingering question is how to better integrate the knowledge management and generation of universities with the policy making needs. So to have a better policy academia interface and to learn not only that in the policy side we read the books or the papers, but to learn how to think with each other. To sit at the same table, to think, to problem solve, to undertake critical thinking, I think is fundamental for the future. An aspect that is also fundamental, that is a lesson that I have learned, is how to move from specialized knowledge to systems thinking. That is one of the most, I think, relevant lessons learned. We need to promote systemic leadership that can actually help us promote change across different subsystems. We need to understand how problems are interconnected and different variables are interconnected. In that sense, universities, I think this is a very interesting experience and experiment. How can we train doctors that understand geopolitics or political scientists that understand systems? That is a fundamental aspect that is at the basis of this need to improve the quality of our mental processes, of how we administer knowledge, and how we can improve the way in which we respond to the global challenges that we have. And I think so that's one of the reasons why I think systems thinking and a better, much better interface between policy and academia.
All right, and picking up on some of those challenges as well, let me bring Professor Nivi Manchanda into the conversation. Professor Manchanda, you're someone who critiques the borders of international relations. I want to understand from you, how can universities then help dismantle some of the intellectual as well as structural barriers that today prevent the perceived global south, as we call it, right? We talk about a divide between the global south and the global north. So what can universities do to dismantle some of the barriers that are preventing the global south from being an architect of, rather than just a recipient of global progress?
Thank you. That's a really great question, and thanks for inviting me. I'd also like to agree with my co-panelists that universities are really crucial, and two of the reasons they're really crucial are because of the fact that they inculcate critical thinking, which was needed more than ever, I would say now, and also because they do have this sense of speaking truth to power, and we know that the truth is getting more and more contested. There are many truths, there are no truths. This is something we hear all the time. And universities still try to have, if not the truth, then the best researched answer to a possible question. And I think that's really crucial. In terms of the global north, global south, let me just unpack that a bit further. So where I'm located, which is in the United Kingdom, universities themselves are facing huge challenges. One of them is funding, and the other is a pretty solid attack from the far right. So universities are becoming institutions that are getting less money even as student numbers rise. So students still want to go to university. So there's quite a lot of complexity there. And in my university, in the University of London, there have been really good attempts at fighting the far right, but also at momentum gathering sort of exercises that challenge hierarchies between the global south and the global north. So there's been a great initiative called Decolonize the University, which Oxford has also been quite key in. And they are doing a lot of good work at looking at how not only colonization, but post-colonialism, or what we might call decolonization, continues to structure hierarchies between the global north and the global south. But I think sometimes the global north and the global south also become reified, become kind of static categories. There is no one global south. I came from India, from a pretty privileged background, so I got to go to the best universities in the West. That's not the same for everyone. If you're in Brazil or South Africa, and if you're rich, you have access, as much access as rich kids in the global north, but not as much, nearly as poor kids in the global north, and of course, not nearly as much as poor kids in the global south. The other thing is that there is because of this kind of fragmentation of global politics, I think universities in the global south themselves are becoming stronger, and that's a really good thing. So the idea that they shouldn't just be recipients has changed, right? They don't need to be recipients. They can make that progress themselves, and they might be the ones diffusing and disseminating that progress. The final thing I want to say is that the attack on universities looks very different where you are based. So for instance, in Gaza, there's no universities left. In Lebanon, 2 university professors were killed yesterday. So I feel like there's structural questions that need to be answered that have something to do with colonization and the legacies of colonization, but also to do with the shifting world order. And I think universities, once again, are very well placed to unpack those questions and to parse those distinctions.
That's actually an excellent point for me to start my, ask my next question. You're talking about the ability of universities to deal with, of course, the current geopolitical climate. Professor Orsi, then on that note, I want to understand from you. We're living in a world where there is more and more polarization, and at the same time, we're also talking about the rise of a national consciousness. And that's not just true to certain countries. It's, I think, all over the world, more and more countries are becoming more aware of a concept of us versus the other, that the other is coming in and they're taking the jobs, et cetera, and of course, so I just want to understand from you some of the concepts that we have, for example, grown up with. I would say that those are concepts that have been adopted from Western perspectives. It could be concepts of democracy, of liberalism. All of those are very Western concepts, and we have in Asia, in the eastern part of the world, our own concepts. For example, India has been guided by Vedic philosophies for a very long time, but we don't necessarily teach those in our universities. We still focus on, for example, talking about democracy rather than talking about the Vedic principles of the rights for everyone. So I just want to understand from you, what is the role that universities then should be playing in ensuring that in the current geopolitical climate where there is a rise of nationalism, is that an opportunity to perhaps start imparting knowledge based on our own value systems? Because those value systems led us to where we are today, and do we now need to go back and reflect upon those and teach our students and people who are working in our country those values, and are they better suited to guide us into a more coherent future? That's my question to you. How do we move away a little bit from the Western gaze and we go back into just imbibing what is truly ours? And this is not to say that there's something wrong with Western philosophies. It is only to understand that certain concepts may not be applicable to everyone.
Definitely. So thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. It's really an honor to be part of this panel, part of this event. Your question, of course, is a very complex question. I'm just going to mention perhaps a few things, and I'm probably concentrating on the role of universities, what we can do as universities, institutions, and even as individual professors and academics. Yes, in many respects, the world that we live in, I always tell my students, look, the world we live in is extremely complex. Not only that, but has never been tried before. We never had so many people. We never had so much interconnectedness and so much interdependence. This world is pretty much experimental, and also doesn't come from particularly just and fair foundations. So the globalized world and the spread of certain kinds of universalism, which also contains things that are normally considered good, like democracy and liberalism, comes from expansion of the West, which was not exactly just diffusion of ideas. This was also project of domination, oppression, colonialism, and so on. So then the question becomes, what can be done about perhaps saving, so rescuing a dimension of universalism, while at the same time recovering more regional perspectives whereby different cultures had their own set of values. I personally am not so enthusiastic about the concept of value, but let's simplify the discourse by saying, of course, several cultures have their own discourses about themselves, about politics in general, and it makes a lot of sense that such communities go back to their past and recover parts of that. But at the same time, we also wish to maintain a universal dimension. I don't think that is very contradictory in reality, because every culture fundamentally produces concepts, structures to solve problems. So if you see that from a functionalist perspective, we as human beings are always social beings necessarily. We live in societies, great variety of societies, but fundamentally we also have to solve a set of common problems, okay? And so already anthropologists in the last century have noticed that many structures actually converge in that. So many, let's say, myths, you can find the same myths, more or less with the same structures in many, many different cultures, because we, as human beings, we have to deal with several similar problems. So let's say how to deal with your parents, how to deal with figures of authority, how to deal with men, how to deal with women, right? So in a way, we can converge, we do converge as cultures as a core in our forms of looking for solutions of common problems. Then what we can do as universities in navigating this complex compromise between fragmentation and universalism, well, first of all, I think we need to continue to believe in the force of dialogue. So continue to have channels opened and conversation, and especially having good faith conversation, which is not easy, is a difficult exercise, but I strongly believe we should try to do that more often. So we are the people who can talk to the counterparts, or we should be able to talk to counterparts, no matter what, because yes, we are also citizens of certain countries, but we should also be loyal to higher principles of learning and of love for knowledge. So that's something that should unify us also beyond differences. Then, as a scholar who lives in the East, I live in Japan, but comes from the West, I also wonder, and I discuss often with my students, how we can integrate Eastern perspectives and Western universalist sort of tendencies. And it's a very difficult discussion. Also because, again, going back to reification, there is not really a coherent East, right? So let's say a traditional Indian culture is quite analytical, a little bit like the Greek culture, but the traditional Chinese culture is very synthetic, is based on a different way of communicating ideas, and the Japanese culture even more so, perhaps, in certain respects. So we simply need to find, as I said before, what is fundamentally the function that is beyond certain solution, and we can continue to converge on these aspects. I make a very brief example. Our concept of justice in the West is very much based on the idea of equality. We are fundamentally all equal, right?
Yes.
That's our starting point. But for Confucius, the idea that we treat people equally would be absurd, and not just at all, because people are different. And so you treat people differently, which is also kind of makes sense in a different perspective. So, and then I tell my students, look, yes, in the West we believe in equality, but then we have special rules, special laws for special categories of people. You are more responsible for certain things if you are in charge of certain responsibilities. And also in Confucianism, eventually they have to take care of some kind of evenness of judgment. So I think that's the key. So try to find out the convergence between different arrangements in specific cultures. Thank you.
Yes, and the perfect balance is, of course, what all of us strive for. I'm going to I just have a couple of minutes left. I just want one last quick rapid fire with everyone. Professor C. Rajkumar, just starting with you, same question to everyone. If there's one thing that you could change about the relationship between academia and global policymakers for a more stable 2047, what would that be?
So I think it's fair to say that we need to move towards developing, universal values. I don't think we can escape from that. I personally believe that the difference between the so-called Western values and Eastern values are overstated. I think it is fair to say that there are fault lines everywhere. While, for example, historically West could have believed in principles of equality, we know that it took a civil war in the United States and much later for the blacks to have meaningful rights. We have even European countries, including Switzerland, did not give the right to vote for women till the 1960s and early 70s, when a country like India, just at the dawn of independence in 1947, our constitution provided for a universal adult franchise, including the right to vote for women. I want to make the larger point that I think it is important for us to recognize that regardless of whichever civilizational heritage and lived experiences societies come from, we need to recognize and come to terms with the idea of certain universal values. And in many ways, we need to recognize that there ought to be institutions that we need to invest in. I mean, one of the remarkable challenges that we are facing, and we heard the Israeli ambassador to India, and one of the questions that I wanted to ask him, and I will throw that question right away, is that, Israel, for example, is one country which benefited from international law. Post Second World War, the establishment of United Nations and the establishment of the global order to build principles of international rule of law was the most fundamental, in many ways, the sort of transitional shift after the Second World War. Now we are, after 75 years, wondering what is going to be the future of international law? What is going to be the future of global institutions? We need to invest in those ideas for the future.
All right, I have to wrap up, but I just want to give 30 seconds to everyone. Professor Tudor.
So one thing I'd like policymakers to understand is that in an era of massive AI disruption, universities will be the preeminent site of facilitating critical thinking skills. And in particular, an example of this is that Stanford, as this university that's at the center of this AI disruption, has recently instituted a critical thinking mandatory course for all freshmen. So it's not a pie-in-the-sky idea. These are, in an era of misinformation and disinformation, where we're going to develop those skills.
Professor Gomez.
I would like to propose to revalue the importance of the word global. That is the global discussion space, the global communication space, where there are global institutions that are the only spaces where all of humanity meets to collaborate, to discuss, and to understand each other. And there is currently this ongoing narrative that global institutions are not good or are failing. And one fundamental function that global spaces provide for humanity is being this meeting place where all of us can bring ideas, perspectives, and traditions of thinking together. Last but not least, I would say we need to recalibrate also how we teach history. Because history is not an independent department, it's not a closed chapter, is what helps us understand where we are and how we arrived at where we are. And we need to incorporate the understanding of history in every single problem that we are addressing. So I think that really constitutes a challenge to the way in which we collaborate with our past and how we teach the past so that we can bring it into the future in the concept not only of managing what happened, but what lessons we learned from the past so that we don't repeat them in the present time.
All right, Professor Manchanda, same question to you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think politicians and policymakers should take universities more seriously because they are a site of critical thinking, but also universities are not governed by election cycles, so they are actually producing knowledge that, as far as possible, is objective. Thanks.
All right, Professor Orsi, last word to you.
Yes, I think policymakers should think more about universities also as schools with young people, and these young people need help in a way, so they need to be exposed to transformative experience and so on. So I think taking the students at the center of the policymaking with regard to universities, I think it would be better, like human element.
All right, on that note, I've completely run out of time, but thank you so much to all our professors for joining us at NXT 2026.
But absolutely, thanks to that panel, the entire panel, of course, for your thoughts, your views, and of course also some messages for particularly the young ones who are also in universities today watching you. Also, of course, you had a lot to say for policymakers as well, for the education sector, and let's certainly hope for more collaboration as well between all the universities in the room and those watching as well. With that, we conclude the segment of Next in Education, and we move forward to Next in Tech once again. And of course, in the tech space, a company that is creating a lot of waves is, of course, the next one that I'm going to be introducing. We have with us to speak on the new era of health, from curative to preventive and predictive. A keynote address by Mr. Gaurav Gupta, founder and CEO of Gabit. Could we please have you on stage, Gaurav? Welcome to NXT 2026.